So recently I went down a rabbit hole exploring Instapoetry, and I don't really know how to feel about it. So what stood out to me most was that in articles that praised the accessibility and the changing of poetic norms, they picked good Instapoetry. Articles lamenting the breakdown of real poetry, ugh, the term, not actual, throw up to all poetry, picked very cringy or outright unpleasant pieces. The thing is, these good and bad poems were written by the same poets. While it isn't surprising that the article writers would pick poems that prove their points, what I do think is really significant is how moving I found some of these poems and how much I loathed others by the same poet. And I'm not sure this is a super uncommon way to feel about it. I have quite a few authors, both poets and novelists, whose work I love, and yet every once in a while they put out a novel that I just cannot get behind. Are these Instapoets any different? I don't think so. I read a lot about how Instapoetry apparently ruins the format and the point of traditional poetry. And you know what? I have to ask, isn't that a good thing? I'm not saying all Instapoetry is good. In fact, I think the majority of the Instapoetry content that exists online isn't great. And even the stuff that is really good, I'd still probably take my favorite poets, Walt Whitman and Edna St. Vincent Millay, over most of these Instapoems. But that doesn't mean I can't appreciate what Instapoetry has done for the entire genre of poetry. First and foremost, let's be real about this. Instapoetry has excited people about poetry. If you look at the sales for poetry anthologies, or just poetry books written by Instapoets, the numbers have skyrocketed. Maybe the people buying these collections aren't interested in older poetry, more traditional poetry, but isn't that okay? The traditional works aren't going anywhere. Why not move the genre in a new direction? Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass was widely criticized for not being traditional, and people thought it was too explicit and raunchy and all these other things. Hell, Charles Dickens sold his books by the chapter. Great people within our literary canon are remembered as great, in part because they took chances and steps and opportunities that nobody else would. I see a bunch of people say about instant poetry, well, I could do that. Well, it's 3 lines and it's a general statement. And it's like, yeah, but you didn't. You didn't write that out. You didn't market it. You didn't put it on Instagram. You didn't make it highly shareable. So no, not anybody could do it. Maybe in theory, but in practice, people didn't. I think it's also very important to understand that these people's success doesn't take away from the grandness or the success of older poetry. And I will say this, I do wonder also if some of the people upset by Instapoetry are also people who write more traditional poetry. I don't know. I'm not saying that's the case, but I think maybe if you look, for some people, if you were to look at these poets, these Instapoets who write 3 lines and, get tons of shares and book contracts and everything else, and you spend all your time on, an Italian sonnet, maybe you look at that and go, oh, well, they're not as worthy as I am. And that's a bad fucking attitude. We should be supporting other people. I'm not saying that that's everybody's attitude or even some people's. I don't know. But I have to wonder about how much we're cheering for other people to fail in this case, okay? Instapoets found a wonderful way to market themselves, because let's be real, that's actually one of the largest contributors to their success. They've made their work generally visually appealing to look at, and it's all highly shareable and clickable and readable. It's uploaded on sites that use this shareability all the time for things to go viral. It's a brilliant business and marketing move. Another thing Instapoetry has done, when I was talking about making it accessible to other people, the language that's used, the fact that there's no rhyming schemes, no punctuation, it does feel a little less elitist than a lot of poetry that, I admit, the poetry I love does often feel a little more elitist and less accessible to people. I remember reading poetry in university that, man, if you didn't know the backstory and the history and hadn't learned this, you would not get the same thing out of the poem that somebody who did know all of this backstory and context did. And that's the thing about Instapoetry. You don't need backstory or context. You don't need to know anything about the author. You don't need to know anything about the time they're writing in. It's just there for you to relate to. And I think that's really important, actually. Some of this Instapoetry, I will fully admit that I don't see the appeal. Some of it I do. But I see people talking about how this poet or that poem helped them in their lives in a meaningful way. And even if it didn't move me, I'm thrilled. It's great, because just because it didn't move me doesn't mean it can't be the thing that moves other people. Art is subjective. My brother-in-law gave me this one Christmas not really knowing what it was. He just knew I liked poetry. This book, where is it? Does not do anything for me. It doesn't move me, it doesn't shake me. I don't feel it down in the core of my soul. That doesn't mean that other people don't. And that doesn't mean other people are wrong. And it doesn't mean I'm wrong. We all get to have our opinions on this stuff. I think it is great that R.H. Sin has done this, has made this book. I think it's great that they're writing, they're putting their thoughts on paper, they're reaching other people. I think it's wonderful. I wish I liked this, because I want to like things. I want to see people succeed. This person is succeeding, and me disliking it, or you disliking Instapoetry, or you liking Instapoetry, doesn't change the fact that these people are succeeding. You know, I wrote the script out for this, and I'm getting a lot more off script and passionate about this than I kind of expected to, because the more I think about it, the more angry I am that some people are questioning the validity of these people's art. Now I'm mad. I do have some very complicated thoughts about Instapoetry, because on one hand, I do get that it is so different and it eschews so many traditional rules, including things like basic punctuation and basic capitalization. While on the other hand, doesn't it seem gatekeepy to try to tell people how to write? Plus, I think that maybe it's extra gatekeepy to tell people what should and shouldn't move them when it comes to the media they consume. I'm not, however, torn on the issue of whether it should exist, because I think art, and yes, you know what, Instapoetry is art, whether or not you personally enjoy it, is subjective, but it has always had a right to exist. And we as humans have the right to decide for ourselves what moves us and what we consider to be good art. For example, do I feel particularly moved by a dump truck dumping dirt down a hill? No, but it was a piece of art that was created, and I think art is all about intent. If the person who set that dump truck up intended it to be art, it is. A trash can full of random things might not be art, but the person who put them there and decided they had a meaning and named the piece and put it in an art museum thinks it's art, so it's art. Hot takes. Even if no one else considers it to be good art. Defining art is a huge concept, and even as I make my statement about this, I can feel like little doubts and like, oh, but what about this? Oh, but little about this. And I think about it and I'm like, you know what? I still stand by this, because honestly, I don't have the time or the want in my life to want to sit here and go, that's art, that's not art, that's art, that's not art. If I don't like it, I'm just not gonna fucking look at it. If I think R.H. Sin's Instapoetry just isn't for me, I'm not gonna fucking read it. I will say this, I probably have a review coming about this, but I did read Rupi Kaur's Milk and Honey, Instapoetry, published into a big book. I liked some of it, I didn't like other parts of it. That's a-okay. I think what she's doing is great, and I think she deserves all the win and praise that she has been getting. Hot take. Considering all the prizes she's won, I'm not actually sure this is a hot take, but the point is, here's the thing. We have our definitions of poetry, and our definitions of poetry have changed throughout the centuries. Why can't they change again? And I think, you know what, even if it doesn't look like more traditional poetry, it is poetry. It's a new form of poetry, and we have to adapt and accept that this is a new form of poetry the way we've accepted every other change in poetry, whether it's free verse or sonnets or, you know, getting rid of a rhyme scheme or whatever it is. We have to accept poetry is changing. And it's not even like all poetry is changing. I know tons of people who still write traditional poems. So I don't get what the big deal is. At the end of the day, if you love all Insta poetry or hate all Insta poetry, or like me, and I think probably most people, like some of it, don't like others, don't really care, it is poetry and these people are poets. Just because we call it Insta poetry and them Insta poets, I think is more like a genre, right? Non-fiction author, fiction author, fantasy author, sci-fi author, romance writer, because some people prefer the term writer to author. It depends. Who knows? Who cares? And here's the thing. If people are moved by this work, good. All life is us striving to find fleeting moments of connection and feeling. And if people feel a connection to Rupi Kaur or R.H. Sin's work, the same way I feel a connection when I listen to Shoemaker by Nightwish or read Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, then I'm happy. Because those things bring me joy and light and purpose and beauty, and everyone should experience that no matter what work it is that they find it through. Hot take. This video is full of them.